I was halfway through locking the south access door when I saw myself standing beyond the northern gate. Not a reflection, not a trick of glass. He was outside in the floodlights, one hand resting on the chain link, as if he'd been there for hours, watching me fail in real time. He looked older than I was, but only by the kind of years fear adds to a face. His uniform wasn't mine. Dark gray instead of contractor blue. Border insignia stitched incorrectly, or older, or from somewhere that had made a different decision decades ago. The radios were all screaming at once. One on the desk said, "Checkpoint 4, do not let him in." Another, in a voice so degraded it sounded underwater, whispered, "He's already inside." The overhead crossing lights snapped on, bathing the road in white that felt thick enough to touch. Behind the older version of me, traffic crawled through the mountains where no road had existed for years. Headlights in both directions. Dozens of them, then hundreds, all silent. He raised a photograph against the fence. My own face stared back at me from it, older still. Then he mouthed something I understood even before the glass began to bend inward. "Don't trust Lena." The northern gate opened by itself, and from the darkness beyond him, something began to speak in my dead sister's voice. 48 hours earlier, I took the contract because it paid too much for how little it seemed to require. That should have been enough to tell me something was wrong, but by then, I had gotten used to taking what came without asking why it was available to me. Men in my position do that. Men who need cash fast and sleep badly and avoid towns where people might remember their names. The listing had appeared on a subcontractor board 3 days before I applied. Temporary night security, remote crossing facility, hazard bonus included. No interview beyond a video call with a woman in Denver who never looked directly into her webcam. No drug test, no references checked. They wanted somebody immediately. I said yes before she finished explaining the location. The crossing sat in a mountain pass near the northern line, though not one used on any current map app. The highway to the other side had supposedly been cut off years ago by a landslide, and the border station had been mothballed soon after. My job, I was told, was to maintain the facility overnight, while a federal dispute over land use was resolved. Watch the cameras. Keep the generators running. Log disturbances. 8 nights on site, then transport back out. Normal men might have asked why a dead crossing needed 24-hour security. I needed the money, and Normal had stopped applying to me 11 months earlier. That was how long it had been since the accident. The report said driver fatigue, wet pavement, limited visibility, no criminal negligence. Everybody was kind about it, which somehow made it worse. They kept using words like tragic and unavoidable, and nobody could have reacted in time. The woman in the other car died before paramedics arrived, and her son, 9, maybe 10, survived with a broken collarbone and a scar that would probably pull at one eyebrow for the rest of his life. What the report did not say was that I had looked down at my phone when it buzzed. Not for long, half a second, maybe less, long enough. I did not tell the state trooper. I did not tell the insurance investigator. I did not tell the woman's husband when he asked me in the hospital hallway whether I remembered seeing her swerve. I said no, sir. I had been drifting from job to job ever since. The road to the checkpoint narrowed into switchbacks as dusk settled over the mountains. Pines climbed the slopes in black rows. Fog gathered low in the ravines, not like weather, but like breath collecting inside a room. The final stretch was gravel. A rusted sign still stood near the last bend, its reflective lettering flayed off by years of wind. Beyond it, the crossing appeared all at once. Concrete barriers, floodlight poles, 2 vehicle lanes beneath a steel canopy, a squat checkpoint building with mirrored windows, and farther north, a chain-link gate spanning the road like a stitch through a wound. The mountains crowded close around the facility. That was the first thing I noticed. The second was the silence. Even empty places have a kind of life to them. Wind-rattling signs, insects in the weeds, distant water somewhere under rock. Here, the quiet felt arranged. A man from the day transport named Garrison met me in the lot. He wore no badge, only a contractor vest and a sidearm he never acknowledged. He looked tired, in a way I recognized immediately. Not lack of sleep, but lack of faith in the usefulness of sleep. "You Damien Cole?" he asked. I said yes. He handed me a key ring, a radio, and a manila folder thick with printed pages. "That's orientation. Anything I should know that's not in there?" He looked at the northern gate before answering. "If the lights come on, write down the time." "Why would they come on?" "No idea." He said it too quickly. "Power issue, maybe." "You work days?" "Sometimes." That word sat wrong between us. He showed me the basics with the efficiency of someone trying not to linger. Generator room, camera monitors, fuel logs, break room, bunk room, and an armory door that was mechanically locked and not for contractor use. His voice flattened whenever he described the northern side of the crossing, as if reading from a script he had repeated enough to stop hearing. Before he left, he tapped the folder in my hand. "Follow those. Always." His eyes moved to mine then, and for the first time, he seemed fully awake. "Yes," he said, "always." After his truck disappeared down the access road, I stood alone in the checkpoint office and opened the packet. It was typed on government letterhead. Dry, procedural. The first page carried the seal of the Department of Infrastructure Security and the name of the contracted facility management company beneath it. There were maintenance schedules, emergency codes, maps of the 5 main zones, and then a page titled Night Operations Protocol. The rules were numbered. Keep all gate cameras operational at all times. Report any person or vehicle approaching from the northern side. Do not leave the checkpoint building between 0000 and 0300 hours. If the crossing lights activate, document the event. Do not interfere. Do not respond to voices heard over inactive channels. If clocks in separate buildings disagree, use the checkpoint office clock as reference. At dawn, inspect the northern gate for damage. Do not cross the marked line. There were initials at the bottom in blue ink. R.V. Morrow, Site Supervisor. I read them twice. Nothing about them seemed especially strange at first. Bureaucracies love instructions. Remote facilities breed superstition. Somebody had probably heard enough ghost stories from bored guards to formalize them into policy. It might even have been a liability measure. If anything went wrong, the paper trail would show they had warned you. I made coffee from a machine old enough to be considered evidence and carried the packet to the desk. The monitors showed the crossing from 12 angles: south approach, parking area, checkpoint lanes, garage interior, customs offices corridor, immigration hall entrance, generator shed, and 3 views of the northern gate, all empty. Around 10:30, I started logging minor issues the way the packet instructed. One flickering fluorescent in the hall, a sticky lock on the garage door, static on camera 9. The work helped. Routine always helped. If my hands were occupied, my mind stayed quieter. It was close to 11 when I opened the center desk drawer, looking for spare batteries, and found the second packet. It had been shoved beneath an old ledger, folded once, and held together with a black binder clip. No letterhead, no official seal. The pages were lined, torn from a legal pad, filled with tight block handwriting in dark pencil that had pressed through several sheets. The first line read, "If you found the typed rules first, do not follow them after midnight." My skin tightened across my shoulders. I sat down and read the rest. Disable all cameras before 0000. Never look directly toward the northern road. If the crossing lights activate, hide immediately and remain silent. Anyone approaching from the northern side has already crossed. The office clock lies last. Trust the garage clock when times differ. Do not let anyone convince you dawn is safe. If you hear your own voice outside, do not answer. At the bottom, written smaller than the rest, almost as an afterthought. Morrow was wrong in the end. Don't repeat what he did. S. Ortega. I checked the typed packet again. Morrow had signed that one. My first thought was a prank. My second was that one of the previous guards had cracked under isolation and tried to sabotage whoever came next. But there was no shakiness to the handwriting, no spiraling paranoia. The instructions were precise, deliberate. Several words were underlined with such force that the paper had nearly torn. I searched the office for mention of Ortega and found nothing in the current roster. That should have been the strangest part of the night. It wasn't. At 11:43, all 3 northern gate monitors flickered at once. For less than a second, the empty road beyond the fence was replaced by a line of headlights curving down the mountainside. Cars. Too many to count. Then the image snapped back to darkness and brush. I checked the live feed label. No playback. No error flag. On camera 11, a taillight smear remained for 3 frames after the road went empty again, like the image had been dragged across the screen by something moving too quickly to understand. I remember sitting there with both rule packets open side by side, listening to the building settle around me, and realizing I no longer had any instinct for which version of danger a man should fear more, the one printed officially, or the one hidden for whoever came after. At 11:58, the office clock ticked over to midnight. From somewhere outside, deep in the mountains where the road had ended years ago, I heard the slow mechanical clunk of the crossing lights powering on. I did not disable the cameras before midnight. That detail mattered later, mostly because I spent a long time trying to decide whether the decision had been mine. At the time, it felt simple. The typed rules were official. The handwritten packet, if genuine, had been hidden rather than submitted. One carried institutional weight, the other carried fear. Fear is persuasive, but bureaucracy is designed to survive on paper. So I left the monitors running and kept my chair facing the desk instead of the windows. The crossing lights outside hummed to life in stages. First, the low sodium wash over the south lanes, then the harsher floods beneath the canopy. Last came the northern mast lights, which illuminated the chain-link gate and the first 100 yards of broken road beyond it. I documented the event at 001 exactly, as instructed. Nothing happened. No alarms. No movement at the gate. No shadow passing where no shadow should be. Just a dead road in white light. By 0012, I began to feel embarrassed for being tense. By 0019, Camera 10 showed a sedan rolling slowly to a stop on the northern side of the closed gate. I froze. The vehicle was dark blue, late model, road-dusted, with headlights on low beam. Behind it, more lights moved down the mountain switchbacks in a thin, patient stream. They followed lanes that did not exist beyond the fence, sweeping around curves that had supposedly been eaten by a landslide years earlier. I turned toward the window. Outside, nothing. Not too far away to make out. Not obscured by fog. Nothing. Floodlights washed the gate. The road beyond it ended in darkness and rubble exactly where Garrison had said it did. No headlights. No engine noise. No car. On the monitor, the sedan's driver lowered a sun visor, checked a mirror, and drummed fingers on the steering wheel. I stood up so fast, the chair rolled into the filing cabinet. The discrepancy lasted maybe 6 seconds before the feed shivered and returned to the empty road. But I had seen enough details to understand I wasn't looking at a corrupted image. The driver had been a woman in a winter hat. There had been a child asleep in the back seat, with his forehead against the glass. I know, because when the child shifted, the reflection of his face caught the dashboard light, and I had the revolting, immediate conviction that I had seen that same profile before under hospital fluorescence, wrapped in gauze. I spent the next hour checking every cable junction on the northern system. I inspected the server rack, rebooted the DVR, verified timestamps, and swapped monitor inputs. Nothing obvious was wrong. The feeds came back stable. Empty gate, empty road. When I crossed into the customs offices during the check, I noticed the wall clock there read 1:14, while my wristwatch read 1:08. I assumed the clock battery was dying until I returned to the main office and found that the office clock also read 1:08, 6 minutes ahead in customs. The typed packet's sixth rule came back to me. If clocks in separate buildings disagree, use the checkpoint office clock as reference. I wrote the discrepancy down. Then I went to the vehicle inspection garage to look for spare batteries and found the clock there reading 1:02, 6 minutes behind. I stared from that clock to my watch and back again, irrationally offended. Not frightened yet. Frightened requires a stable frame of reference. What I felt was administrative irritation. The same emotion you feel when a hotel room key stops working or an airline loses luggage. A refusal of the normal sequence. Something had failed to be where it belonged. The garage smelled of oil, wet concrete, and old antifreeze. An inspection pit ran between the bays beneath a steel grating. Someone had left a clipboard on a workbench with 3 signatures on it, the most recent dated 9 months earlier. I turned the page over and found a list of camera maintenance notes that referred to blind spots I couldn't reconcile with the layout of the building as I knew it. At 1:31, office time, at least, the south corridor lights dimmed, then brightened again. I returned to the monitors and began watching the archived recordings from the previous 3 nights, looking for evidence that I had inherited a broken system and nothing more. Some cameras showed exactly what they should have: weeds pushing through cracks in the pavement, moths looping in the floodlights, my own truck in the lot from earlier that evening. Others did not. On one recording labeled Cam 09/North Approach 2347, rain sheeted across the lens. Outside my actual window, the night was clear. On another, 2 semis idled beneath the canopy, while agents in reflective jackets checked manifests at a checkpoint that in waking reality had been shut for years. A digital clock in the corner matched the timestamp exactly. One of the agents laughed at something said off-screen. A man stepped out of the passenger side of the lead truck, stamped his feet against the cold, and lit a cigarette. He looked directly into the camera, as if he knew I was there. The image fuzzed. When it returned, the lane was empty again. I told myself there was some technical explanation involving corrupted backups, old footage incorrectly indexed, and host data in a failing recorder. I held on to those phrases because they sounded like causes instead of symptoms. At 2:06, I found a logbook in the bottom shelf beneath the monitors. Leather cover, water-stained corners, entries by several guards going back almost 4 years. Most of it was mundane: generator fuel, delivery confirmations, wildlife sightings. Then the notes grew stranger. North feed is active again. Traffic moderate. No visual confirmation outside. Garage time lagged 6 minutes tonight. Avoided the hall until it settled. Do not watch the line of buses if they appear. They stop when noticed. Ortega says, dawn is the bad window. Morrow disagrees. Both can't be right. That last entry had no signature. At 2:18, a radio on the wall crackled. Not the handheld clipped to my belt. One of the base units was mounted above the desk, which Garrison had assured me was only connected internally. A woman's voice said, very clearly, Checkpoint 3. Do you still have visual on lane 2? I stared at the speaker until static took the rest of her sentence. Then a male voice farther back said, don't let them queue under the lights. Another burst of static, then silence. I answered before I decided to. This is Checkpoint 4. Say again. Nothing. My own voice sounded wrong in the room. Too small for it. I checked the inactive channels, then remembered Rule 5 from the typed packet. Do not respond to voices heard over inactive channels. Too late. At 2:43, the monitors changed again. This time, not just one feed. All the northern views. Camera 10 showed the dark road outside the fence. Camera 11 showed a checkpoint lane active with cones and orange barriers. Camera 12 showed a crowded pedestrian lane I knew did not exist in my world, full of people standing beneath buzzing lights with duffel bags at their feet, waiting their turn to be processed. Some wore winter coats, some wore business suits. One young mother bounced a baby against her shoulder while checking the clock above the hall entrance. None of them looked strange. That was the part that lodged in me. If there had been something overtly unnatural about them, distortion, blood, theatrics, I could have dismissed it as nightmare logic or nervous exhaustion. But they looked like people delayed at an inconvenience they had not deserved. Tired, impatient, resigned, real, and all of them faced north to south, as if trying to enter my side. I noticed then that one man near the front of the line held a folder under his arm, identical to my orientation packet. The floodlights outside brightened. A shape passed behind the windows of the customs office. I turned so fast that my shoulder hit the filing cabinet. The office door stood open to the corridor. Beyond it, the glass wall that looked into customs reflected only fluorescent haze. I waited. Nothing moved again. At 2:59, every monitor went black for exactly 1 second. When the feeds returned, all 3 northern cameras showed the road empty, except for a single object resting against the inside of the sealed gate. A manila folder, same size as mine. At 3 o'clock, the crossing lights shut off. I took the flashlight and stepped into the corridor before I remembered the typed rule: do not leave the checkpoint building between 0000 and 0300 hours. The clock above the office door still said 2:59. I went back inside and locked the door. At 3:06 by my watch and 3:12 in customs, I finally walked out to the gate. There was no folder there, only damp pavement, the smell of ozone, and a fresh set of footprints leading from the northern side to the southern side of the fence. They stopped exactly at the painted line no one was supposed to cross. I met Lena on the 4th night, though later records and memories suggested I had met her earlier. In one version of events, she had been working at the crossing the whole time, and I had somehow failed to notice. In another, she arrived after midnight on foot through the garage bay that should have been dead-bolted from the inside. In the one I trust least but remember most vividly, I first saw her standing on the northern monitors before I heard her knock at the south door. What I know for certain is this: by the time she introduced herself, I was already relieved to see another human face. The first 3 shifts had thinned me out. Sleep in the bunk room came in shallow slivers, full of radio chatter and headlights moving behind my eyelids. Every night, the contradictions multiplied. The immigration hall would appear abandoned on one pass, chairs overturned, dust thick on the windowsills, and active on the next, with fresh coffee in the break area and forms stacked neatly behind the intake counters. The clocks remained split, customs 6 minutes ahead, garage 6 minutes behind, checkpoint office holding the middle like a judge pretending neutrality. Sometimes I would set them all manually and return 20 minutes later to find the difference restored. I began wearing both rule packets folded in separate pockets, as if their physical weight might help me decide which truth I occupied at any given hour. On the 4th evening, just after sunset, I was reviewing payroll files on the office terminal when the south exterior camera showed a woman crossing the lot toward the building. She wore a contractor jacket, a knit cap, jeans tucked into mud-stained boots, and carried a flashlight like she had used it enough to trust its balance. Dark hair pinned back, mid-30s maybe. She walked with the unhurried focus of someone who already knew the layout. I opened the door before she knocked. "You, Damien?" she asked. "Yeah, good." She stepped past me into the office and stamped wet gravel from her boots. Then either they finally hired help, or I'm in the wrong version again. I did not like how naturally she said that. "Who are you?" "Lena Voss." She held up an ID badge clipped inside her jacket. The photo matched. The logo belonged to the same management contractor that had hired me, but the expiration date had passed almost a year earlier. Night lead. I'm the night lead. That's the kind of thing one of us would say, yes. She watched my reaction with a tired sort of sympathy, like a medic about to reset a broken bone. I asked who sent her. She shrugged and said, "Depends on which paperwork you believe." Her presence changed the room. Not because she was obviously threatening. She wasn't. But because she moved through the checkpoint with the ease of prior ownership. She knew the coffee machine was jammed on the left side. She knew the garage service door stuck in damp weather. She knew there were 2 emergency lanterns stored behind the false panel beneath the printer, which I had not found despite checking twice. When I asked why Garrison hadn't mentioned her, she laughed once without humor. Because if you were briefed from their side, I'm either terminated, missing, or dead. I pulled up payroll records to prove the point, and found her name after only a minute. Voss, Lena M. Access revoked 11 months prior. Employment status, inactive. She leaned over my shoulder and studied the screen. "See?" she said softly. "That's exactly what mine said about Ortega." The handwritten packet in my pocket seemed suddenly heavier. "You know Ortega?" "New," she said. "Or not in the timeline you're reading from, apparently." I told her about the 2 orientation packets. She asked to see them. By the time she finished reading, her mouth had flattened into something like pity. "These are mixed sets," she said. "Meaning?" "Meaning you're being trained by more than one side." "There aren't sides." Lena looked toward the northern windows. "You still believe that because you haven't watched anyone come through properly." She reached into her bag and removed a spiral notebook wrapped in a freezer bag to protect it from damp. Inside were pages of handwritten notes, diagrams of the facility, copied logs, names, time discrepancies, and several short rule lists marked with dates and initials. Some overlapped mine. Others contradicted them entirely. According to her current working set, the camera's amplified overlap should be powered down before midnight. Looking north directly increased the chance of recognition events. Midnight to 3 was relatively stable. Dawn caused the transfer. Anyone you met outside might belong to the crossing, not the road. "You expect me to trust a notebook over the official packet?" I asked. "I expect you not to trust anything that insists it's official." It was the kind of line that should have made me dismiss her as unhinged. Instead, I found myself listening harder. She said she had been assigned there for nearly 2 years in her experience of things. Experience was her word, precise and bitter. She described stretches where the crossing functioned normally, inspections, traffic, even occasional buses, and others where the entire northern road beyond the gate seemed to vanish under raw mountain stone. In some versions there were more staff, in other words only her. Once, she said, there had been a dog that belonged to no one and refused to cross from the garage to customs, no matter how hungry it got. "Why stay?" I asked. She hesitated long enough to matter. "Because I think I let somebody through who shouldn't have come through." It was the first moment I trusted her, because it sounded too much like my own private logic. Guilt recognizes itself faster than faces do. We settled into a tense cooperation. She checked the generators while I reviewed the north feeds. She corrected my map of the maintenance corridors and showed me where the abandoned immigration hall could be entered without walking through the main lobby after dark. When I challenged her on specifics, she answered until the subject turned to dates or names. Then she sidestepped. The sidestepping built my suspicion back up. At one point, I asked directly, "What year do you think it is here?" She smiled in a way that was not amusement. "That depends on where you're standing." Later, while she inventoried batteries in the garage, I searched deeper through archived incident files. 3 entries referenced her by name. 2 were routine. The third was 11 months old and marked personnel loss/access breach, internal review pending. The attached narrative was corrupted, but one line remained legible. Voss claimed the second guard was not employed by our agency. Second guard. I was alone in the office when Lena returned, carrying a box of fuses. "Have you ever seen me before tonight?" she asked suddenly. "No." "You're sure?" "Yes." She set the box down carefully. "Then why is there a photo of us in your bunkroom drawer?" I laughed because I thought she was testing me. She didn't laugh back. We went to the bunk room together. The drawer beneath the narrow bed stuck halfway, then jerked open. Inside were spare socks, an old motel pen, my unopened shaving kit, and a Polaroid I had never seen before. It showed Lena and me standing outside the checkpoint beneath daylight clouds. She wore the same contractor jacket. I was in a heavier coat than the one I'd brought, with a week's more beard on me than I currently had. On the white margin, written in marker, "If one of us forgets, the other has to remember not to open the inner gate. No date, no signature." I checked the back, expecting a joke, a serial number, anything ordinary. Instead, there were 2 fingerprints smeared in something dark that might have been old coffee or dried blood. "Is this yours?" I asked. "I was hoping it was yours." We stood there too long, close enough that I could hear the building humming around us and the distant relay click of some system cycling on. Not failing, preparing. That night, we agreed on almost nothing, except one principle. Neither of us would follow any rule, simply because it had been written first. The strange part was how quickly companionship became another source of unreality. I trusted Lena more each hour we worked, side by side. I also became more convinced she might be the mechanism by which the crossing adapted to me. Near midnight, she reached for the power switch that controlled the northern cameras. I caught her wrist. "Leave them on," I said. "Turn them off. If they're the only record we have, they are not a record. They're a window. Same difference. No." She pulled free. "That's exactly the difference that gets people folded." Folded. I hated the word because I understood it without wanting to. We compromised by disabling only the recording server and leaving the live feeds active. It was the sort of middle ground frightened people invent when they need to feel intelligent. At 12:17, a shape appeared on camera 9, standing in the immigration hall. Tall, motionless, just beyond the metal detector that should not have had power. I turned to call Lena. She was already looking at the same figure from the hallway outside the office door. But when I glanced back at the monitor, the hall was empty. Behind me, Lena whispered, "That's not where I saw it." The fog came in low and fast on the 6th night, sliding through the floodlights in sheets that made distance collapse. Beyond the first barrier posts, the world looked unfinished. By then, Lena and I had worked out a ritual of partial trust. We compared clocks every hour. We kept separate logs and read each other's entries before midnight, then stopped sharing once the crossing lights came on. We never entered the northern lane together. We never spoke a name twice if we heard it over the radio. We tried, in other words, to build procedures from contradiction. It almost worked. The first sign of trouble was the intercom chirping on its own at 0041. Not the wall radio this time, the gate speaker. A burst of static, then a man's breathing. Lena, who was pouring stale coffee down the sink, went still with the mug in her hand. "Don't answer," she said. The typed packet in my pocket said, "Report any person approaching from the northern side." The handwritten one said, "Anyone approaching from the northern side has already crossed." The speaker crackled again, and a voice said, hoarse with cold, "Please." I was already at the monitor. Camera 10 showed a man standing at the outer northern gate, bent slightly forward, as if he had been walking into the wind for a long time. He wore a dark coat crusted white at the shoulders. No hat. One hand gripped the chain link. The fog moved around him but never seemed to touch him directly, leaving a clean silhouette like a cutout pressed against the weather. He looked exhausted, human. Mid-40s maybe. Lena came to stand beside me. "Don't engage. He could be lost. There is nowhere for him to be lost from." On screen, the man lifted his face toward the camera. Even through the grain, I could see raw desperation in it. His lips were split. His eyes kept flicking over his shoulder to the road behind him, though the fog there was too dense to show anything. "Please," he said again through the speaker. "Open the gate." I picked up the intercom handset. Lena took it from me and set it back down with deliberate care. "If he's real," she said, We can't help him from here. If he's real, and I do nothing, that's still a choice. And if he isn't, I almost told her I was practiced at living with the wrong choice. But the sentence lodged behind my teeth. Some confessions are too selfish to count as honesty. The speaker hissed. The man coughed, hard enough to double over. I walked from marker 9, he said. There were lights. I saw your lights. Something came after dark. I need you to let me in. Marker 9 meant nothing to me. Lena's expression changed. Not fear exactly. Recognition. There is no marker 9 here, she said quietly. Here, I echoed. She didn't answer. The man straightened and pressed closer to the gate. I know you can hear me. If you leave me out here, it'll use my voice. My hand was on the intercom again before Lena could stop me. This is border security, I said, hating how official I sounded. State your name. He blinked at the camera as if the question itself confused him. Then he said, Morrow. Lena made a sound in her throat and backed away from the desk. I felt every small hair along my arms rise. R.V. Morrow? I asked. The man frowned. Richard. Opened the gate. In the typed packet, Morrow was the supervisor who signed the official rules. In the hidden packet, Ortega had written that Morrow was wrong in the end. Don't repeat what he did. Lena shook her head violently. No. The man slammed his palm against the chain link. It's close. I could hear nothing beyond him. No footsteps, no animal movement, only the fog dragging across metal and the high electrical whine of the floodlights. What's close? I asked. The answer came in 3 different voices at once. The line. I dropped the handset. The man on the monitor straightened further than a tired body should have. Not a broken motion. A corrected one. Like frames of film being spliced into a different sequence. His coat darkened, then lightened. The collar became military wool, then denim, then something reflective. His face shifted younger, older, bearded, clean-shaven, accent slipping, jaw changing shape between syllables. Lena whispered, "Don't open it." But the typed rules said report. Protocol implied contact. Containment implied barriers that mattered. I had spent months punishing myself for one moment of inattention. Faced with a pleading stranger, I could not bear another failure built from hesitation. I keyed the outer gate release. The magnetic lock buzzed. On screen, the man smiled with relief, and with someone else's mouth. The gate opened 6 inches. He stepped forward and became several people, not illusions layered on top of him, not visual distortion. It was worse, because it was sequential and simultaneous, as if time were riffling through options and failing to settle. A young woman in a school blazer, an old man with blood on his temple, a soldier carrying a helmet, a customs officer in formal dress greens, a boy in a soaked hoodie, then the original man again, or near enough to him to hurt. Every version wore the same expression at the exact instant it realized I had let it through. Then the space between the gateposts emptied. No running figure, no blur vanishing into fog, just absence. The intercom stayed live. I could hear the gate chain trembling in the wind. Lena swore and shoved past me out of the office. "Where are you going?" "To lock the inner barrier before it picks one." That sentence meant nothing, and somehow I understood it too late. I followed her into the corridor. The fog outside turned the windows white. Somewhere deeper in the building, a door banged once, then again, from opposite directions. Lena sprinted toward the immigration hall instead of the main entry. Why there? Because if it came through as intake personnel, that's where it'll anchor. I was close behind when the corridor lights flickered. For 1 second, the hall transformed around us. Fresh paint, active terminals, voices from unseen rooms, the smell of wet coats and copier toner. Then back to abandonment, peeling notices, dead kiosks, old dust kicked up by our own feet. At the far end of the lobby, someone stood behind the reception glass. Morrow, I thought. Then no, me. Then neither. The figure raised one hand, palm against the partition. Lena grabbed my jacket and yanked me sideways behind a pillar. "Don't let it establish a witness line," she hissed. "What does that even mean?" She didn't answer, because the building's public address system came alive, overhead with a chime so ordinary, it made the next words unbearable. "Processing lane 4 is now open. Please have your documents ready." The voice was mine. From the desk speakers behind us came a burst of printer noise. When we got back to the office, the terminal was awake, despite having gone to sleep earlier. Personnel records filled the screen. A new entry had appeared at the top of the list. Morrow, Richard V. Status, reassigned. Previous assignment, night supervisor. Crossing 4 next of kin notification. Incomplete. Below it, under archive staff, was another update that made my stomach turn cold. Cole, Damien A. Position, interim supervisor emergency contact, removed at employee request. Start date, 11 months earlier. I had arrived less than a week ago. I checked my phone for the date. The lock screen showed the correct month and year, then flickered and displayed a photo I did not recognize. The checkpoint under winter snow. Lena standing at the north gate with one hand raised, as if signaling someone to stay back. Across the image, in my own text message font, was a note sent to no contact at all. "If he opens the outer gate, don't let him see the reports." When the screen returned to normal, the message was gone. Lena was staring at the monitor wall. I followed her gaze. Camera 11 no longer showed the northern road. It showed the inside of the office from a high angle I knew did not exist. Me standing at the desk, Lena beside the door, and behind us, reflected faintly in the dark window, the man from the fog already inside. We went underground because every version of the building above us had begun to disagree too loudly. That was how Lena phrased it. And by then, I had stopped demanding cleaner language for impossible things. The immigration hall was phasing between vacancy and function every few minutes. The office monitors alternated between empty road, active crossing, and views from camera angles that did not belong to the hardware installed on site. Radios called in from checkpoints with designations I could not map. Twice I heard my own voice issuing instructions in a tone I had never used. Lena said the maintenance tunnels were old enough to predate most of the modifications. Less overlap, she told me, or slower overlap. We entered through a locked panel behind the boiler room, where cinder block gave way to poured concrete older than the rest of the structure. The air below was cold and mineral heavy, with that subterranean smell of wet rock and metal filings. My flashlight beam shook more than I wanted to admit. Lena carried one lantern and her notebook. I carried the key ring, a pry bar from the garage, and both packets of rules in my jacket. The tunnel sloped under the inspection bays, then split. One branch had collapsed behind wire mesh and warning signs. The other continued north toward a sealed records room. Lena said she had only seen once before, and not from this side of events. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means one version of me found it after the breach in winter, and another never did. Keep walking." The walls bore survey markings in different paint colors, some fresh, some flaking with age. I noticed repeated coordinate notations that had been crossed out and rewritten with slight variations. On one section of concrete, someone had written, "Check your shadow count," in grease pencil, and scrubbed at it later, without fully removing the words. We found the records room behind a steel door, chained shut from the outside. The chain had been cut before. I could tell by the bright metal scar on one link and the newer padlock replacing the old. Lena looked at it as if she recognized a wound. "Have you been here?" I asked. "Maybe. That's not good enough anymore." She turned to me in the lantern light, her face drawn and older than I had first thought. "You want good enough? You should have taken a mall security job. It should have started a fight. Instead, it deflated one." We were both beyond the point where anger felt distinct from fear. Inside the room were metal shelves, moisture-warped boxes, survey maps sealed in plastic tubes, and old binders bearing agency seals I had not seen on the surface. Some documents were labeled geological assessment, others traffic contingency, border infrastructure development, and hazard review. A layer of gray dust covered most of it, though several boxes had been disturbed recently. We opened everything. The official history of the crossing was a lie. There had been a landslide, yes, but years after the first internal incidents. The road closure had provided a convenient public explanation for a site already under restricted review. The earliest files dated back almost 2 decades, when foundation crews expanding the inspection garage reported repeated discrepancies in survey coordinates. Stakes placed at measured intervals would appear misaligned by morning despite no sign of tampering. Duplicate site photos taken minutes apart showed different mountain contours. One engineering team documented a utility trench as 22 feet long. Another measured the same trench at 28. Both logs were signed, witnessed, and impossible to reconcile. Then came personnel statements. A foreman wrote that he had watched a laborer emerge from the tunnel access, greet him by name, and continue toward the parking lot, only for that same laborer to radio in moments later from a supply depot 30 miles south. A surveyor reported seeing her own truck parked at the facility, while knowing she had driven a government sedan that week. 2 electricians independently described hearing normal operational noise from customs offices that had not yet been built. One memo, stamped internal only, used the phrase localized jurisdictional disagreement of physical space. Another called it coordinate slippage. A later report, written in the clipped language of someone trying not to sound frightened, said more plainly, "Maps stop agreeing beneath the north foundation line. I found sketches of the anomaly from early geological teams, cross-sections of bedrock, fault diagrams, magnetics, core samples. Then, stranger material, overlapping grids drawn in different colored pencils, like 3 or 4 incompatible site plans stacked on top of each other. In the center of each, directly beneath the checkpoint, someone had circled the same irregular zone and labeled it source point." Lena read over my shoulder. "That's the first time I've seen them call it that." "They knew," I said. "Of course, they knew." Further in were recordings transcribed from interviews with staff during the first containment phase. That was when the language shifted from anomaly to intrusion. At first, the overlap had been described as harmless: inconsistent weather on cameras, short-term time drift, sightings of alternate personnel performing routine work in inaccessible parts of the facility. Then, the encounters became interactive. Teams reported receiving conflicting instructions from supervisors who denied giving them. Guards saw travelers approach from roads closed in their own reality. Several incidents involved recognition distress, in which witnesses became convinced strangers were relatives, former co-workers, or dead family members, until physical contact broke the effect. Then there was a file marked Rule Adaptation Comparison/Cross-Site. Inside were pages of survival protocols from different versions of the crossing. Different fonts, different formatting, different agency names. Some resembled my typed packet, others, Lena's notebook. Some ordered all cameras disabled. Others required constant monitoring. One advised keeping every light on at dawn. Another said lights at dawn invited alignment. Many contradicted each other outright. All were signed by supervisors whose names repeated with small variations across alternate records. Morrow, Mora, Mero. Ortega has 2 initials in one file, 1 in another. Voss is included in 3 separate staff trees, missing in 5. "This is impossible," I said, which by then had become less protest than acknowledgement. Lena tapped a paragraph halfway down one page. "Read that." I did. "The procedures are no longer solely defensive. Recurrence patterns suggest the overlap responds to observation, repetition, and conditional behavior. Each stable protocol appears to reduce immediate casualty rates within one local frame, while increasing cross-frame adaptive complexity. In practical terms, what protects personnel here may educate the phenomenon elsewhere. I read it twice. Educate? I said. That's what I've been trying to tell you. No, you've been telling me pieces. Because pieces are survivable. I wanted to argue, but another file had caught my eye. Incident, personnel, self-encounter events. There were over 40 documented cases. Witnesses meet alternate versions of themselves. Briefings given by men already dead in another file. One guard shot his duplicate in the garage and then discovered the bullet had gone through his own shoulder. There had been a staff psychologist at one stage, which chilled me more than the rest, warned that repeated self-encounters led to identity instability, guilt fixation, and voluntary reassignment behavior, where personnel began acting according to memories that were not theirs. My stomach tightened. What's voluntary reassignment? Lena didn't look at me. People start taking orders from lives they didn't live. Near the bottom of one box, under flood reports and generator repair tickets, I found a sealed evidence envelope containing Polaroids. The first showed the northern gate from the inside, open to a road busy with traffic. The second showed the same gate opening onto a sheer wall of rock where no road had ever existed. The third showed two men in contractor blues, carrying a body bag across the south lot. One of the men was me, or close enough to me that my hand went numb. The timestamp strip in the corner was 11 months old, the week of my car accident. I turned the photo over. On the back, in handwriting I recognized from the hidden packet, Cole arrives carrying a breach in his memory. Monitor closely. I looked up at Lena. She had gone pale but not surprised. You knew my name before tonight, I said. She said nothing. You knew me. In some versions. What does that mean? It means sometimes you come here on purpose. Her voice was flat with exhaustion. Sometimes you were sent because you'd already seen overlap elsewhere. Sometimes you never make it past the roadblock. Sometimes you were the one who found Ortega. I took a step back from her, from the shelves, from the whole refrigerated logic of the room. You should have told me. And which version would that have helped? That was the moment the tunnel lights went out. Not a power failure, a sequence. One bulb after another snapped dark toward us from the north end of the corridor, like something reading its way down a line of text. In the black, the radios on both our belts came alive with layered voices. One said, "Source point active." Another said, "Do not let Cole reach the gate." And in a third, so close it seemed to speak from the concrete itself, my own voice whispered, "You already opened it." We made it back to the surface, through a version of the garage that was not entirely mine. I know that sounds like the sort of sentence a person writes after he has accepted madness as grammar, but there is no cleaner way to put it. The tunnel stairwell should have opened beside Bay 2 near the hydraulic lift. Instead, it let us out behind a caged storage section that did not exist in my layout, under emergency strips glowing green instead of red. The inspection pit was longer, the overhead crane older. The wall clock read 511, though my watch said 457, and the office, when we eventually reached it, insisted on 503. Lena saw my face and said, "Don't start measuring anything right now. Just move." The phenomenon was getting stronger. That much no rule packet could soften. Whole sections of the crossing flickered between versions with the abruptness of channel changes. The abandoned immigration hall sometimes held fresh footprints leading to occupied interview rooms with names on the frosted glass. The customs office alternated between dereliction and full operation often enough that forms began appearing on desks only to yellow into brittle archives while I watched. I found one memo addressed to me as Supervisor Cole, requesting approval for a dawn transfer convoy scheduled in 2019. The worst part was meeting myself. The first time lasted seconds. I rounded the corridor toward the generator room and saw a man in my shape at the far end. Same shoulders, same bad posture, same habit of carrying tension in the neck. He wore military fatigues, with a border patch I didn't recognize. He looked directly at me, raised 2 fingers as if signaling silence, and stepped through the closed door of the old interview room without opening it. The second version was older by decades. I saw him reflected in the dark microwave door in the break room before I saw the actual room behind me. White stubble, deep lines cut from nose to mouth, eyes that looked done with pleading. He was seated at the table, reading one of the handwritten rule sheets, as though he had memorized it years earlier. When I turned, the chair was empty but still warm. The third I found in camera 11 during a brief live feed recovery. Me standing outside the northern gate in a gray uniform, holding a photograph up to the fence. That image I understood only later. Lena did not act shocked when I told her. "You're crossing your own paths now," she said. "That usually means the site is trying to settle on a stable witness." "A what?" "A person who gets remembered the same way in enough versions to hold one of them together. You're talking like the building is alive." "No." She looked toward the ceiling, listening to some distant thud from another floor, or another year. "I'm talking like whatever formed here learned to use buildings because we do." By evening, even our arguments had begun to feel pre-scripted. We had the same fight in different forms over and over. Whether to shut down the remaining cameras, whether to barricade the immigration hall, whether Dawn should be treated as a transition or exposure. Every decision favored one rule set and violated another. Every choice felt like voting in an election whose districts kept moving. Finally, in a lull between radio bursts, Lena sat on the office floor with her back to the filing cabinet and said, "I remember multiple histories now. I thought I had misheard." "What?" She rubbed at her temple as if trying to clear a pressure headache. "Not all at once. More like bleed-through. Little sequences. You're laughing in the garage at a joke I haven't heard yet. Garrison drove off after handing me your folder instead of you. Morrow is locking himself in customs and begging us not to let him wake up on the other side of midnight. There's one where the crossing was still active, and nobody understood what the rules were for until buses started arriving half-empty." Her eyes were bloodshot. She looked frightened in a way I had not seen before, not of what was outside us, but of what was accumulating inside her. "In some of them," she said, "you never arrived at all. In some, you've been here weeks. In one, you shot me in the hall because I told you the typed packet was bait. Did I? I'm still talking to you, so probably not this time. I should have stepped back from her then. Instead, I sat across from her on the tile because I had grown too used to impossible things being delivered in an ordinary voice. What do we do?" She lifted her notebook. "We stop pretending there's a master set of instructions. Every rule belongs to a reality where somebody survived long enough to write it down. That doesn't make it true here. That's not an answer. It's the only one we have." She swallowed. "One reality is trying to become dominant. Maybe that's always what this place does when the overlap gets bad enough. It stabilizes by choosing a rule set, a sequence, and a witness. Once enough things line up around that choice, the others get cut loose. And if we choose wrong," she met my eyes, "then we end up living in the version that wins." The sentence sat between us like a verdict. We tested the idea because there was nothing else left but collapse. In the next hour, we ran controlled contradictions. We shut off camera 9, but left 10 and 11 live. We blocked the northern windows with maintenance tarps while keeping the exterior floodlights active. We synchronized all clocks to the garage time, then to customs, then to the office, logging what changed after each choice. Things changed. When we favored the typed rules, cameras on, windows open, office time authoritative, the active crossing feeds intensified. Traffic appeared on the northern road more often. Internal radios carried more official voices. The immigration hall tended toward operation, with cues, forms, and processing announcements. The danger felt procedural, as if the site wanted to resume function. When we favored the handwritten rules, cameras off, visual avoidance, Garage time. The building itself grew less populated, but more unstable. Hallways elongated. Doors opened into rooms that belonged to other decades. We heard fewer voices, but saw more self-encounters. The danger felt intimate. Neither was safety. They were merely different kinds of appetite. Near midnight, the crossing lights triggered without visible cause. We took shelter in the records office alcove as one rule set advised, then abandoned cover 30 seconds later when the public address system began reading names from what sounded like an intake list. "Those are staff names," Lena whispered. I recognized one, Ortega, then mine, then hers, as if we were not hiding but expected. When the announcement stopped, the southern wall of the checkpoint gave a long, shuddering crack. Not structural failure, translation. The office beyond it brightened, dimmed, and brightened again into another arrangement. Different desks, different monitors. On one screen, a wide-angle camera showed two guards in our office arguing over a notebook. One of them was Lena, the other was a man I had never seen. She saw him, MT, and went rigid. "Who is that?" I was about to ask you, but she looked stricken in a way that told me she knew something she had not said. The image on the monitor updated. The unknown man turned his head toward the camera. His face rippled briefly through 3 near versions before settling. Mine. Lena stood up too quickly, dizzy with it. "No, that's wrong. What isn't?" She pressed a hand over her mouth, then dropped it. "In one history, I wasn't assigned with you. I was assigned to a man named Daniel Cole. Daniel. I thought it was just bleed-through. A name mismatch." Her breathing had gone shallow. "But if there are 2 of you, if the crossing is trying to reconcile," a radio transmission cut across her. "All stations prepare for selection." The voice was calm, professional, and utterly unfamiliar. Then a second voice on another channel, low and raw with panic, said, "Do not let them choose for you." Every light in the checkpoint went white. For a moment, I saw the building not as it was, but as stacked transparencies of itself. Every corridor, every office, every barrier position, every era and version overlaid in one impossible architecture. And in the middle of all of it, beneath the northern line, something vast was listening to how we decided. The entity never appeared to me in a single stable shape. That detail matters, because if it had chosen one form, monster, ghost, distortion, any familiar category, I might have found the courage that comes from naming a thing. Instead, it arrived through recognition. It wore what each witness could not refuse to look at. I first understood that in the customs corridor, the whiteout from the previous hour had faded into rolling power fluctuations. Lena had gone to check the south transformer because the building was drawing current in surges that no dead facility should need. I was alone near the intake counters, following voices that sounded like 2 different briefings happening through the same wall. I turned the corner and saw the woman from the accident standing beneath the exit sign. Not an approximation, not an echo. The exact woman whose face I had tried and failed not to memorize from the courthouse report photo. Mid-30s, auburn hair, a navy raincoat dark at the shoulders. One heel was slightly broken from where her foot must have braced against the floorboard in the final second before impact. She looked tired, not angry. That made it worse. For one mad instant, I believed the crossing had not pulled a symbol from my guilt, but her actual dead self from some other line of existence. "Damien," she said. I could not move. Her voice carried the wet hush of the hospital corridor where I had stood after giving my statement, but her mouth did not always match it. Sometimes the words arrived a half-second early, sometimes late, as if the conversation had been translated across a damaged connection. "You don't have to keep choosing the wrong door," she said. I took one step back. The overhead lights buzzed. Her features shifted, not away from her, but through adjacent possibilities. Younger, older, a bruise on the jaw in one frame, none in another. Beside her, just at the edge of sight, I sensed the shape of a boy lowering his head against a car window. I shut my eyes. When I opened them, she was closer. "I know what you saw," it said, still in her voice. "I know what you didn't admit. That is why you can hear me clearly. I should tell you that I was brave or clever then. I wasn't. I was a frightened man being addressed by the most precisely arranged knife possible. 'What are you?' I asked. Its smile was almost kind. 'Consequence,' it said first. Then, with the same mouth but another cadence layered beneath it, 'aggregation.' Then, softer. 'What remains when enough versions of a life overlap and no border holds?' Lena found me there minutes later, or seconds. Time had stopped earning precision, pressed against the customs desk with my pulse hammering in my ears. She had her flashlight raised like a weapon and was staring at empty air near the exit sign. "What do you see?" I asked. Her face had gone bloodless. "Myself," she whispered. Not the current Lena, not from her expression. Someone she had failed, someone she feared becoming. She took a step back, and the beam in her hand shook violently. That was the pattern through all the archived accounts once I knew how to read them correctly. Religious figures, dead spouses, missing co-workers, alternate selves, strangers whose faces induced immediate intimacy. The entity was not merely mimicking fear. It was selecting the most negotiable surface through which each observer could be taught, misled, or drawn closer. It wanted dialogue. We got it in the office an hour later when all active radios synchronized and the speakers began carrying the same voice, though not the same words. Mine heard the woman in the raincoat. Lena heard another version of herself, older and almost tender, but the cadence beneath both was shared, as two songs played over the same pulse. "We did not come here," it said. I forced myself to answer. "Then what are you doing?" "Becoming." The monitors lit one by one, not with traffic, not with old feeds, but with faces. Dozens of them in grids across the screens. Guards, travelers, clerks, maintenance workers, drivers, paused at barriers, women holding children, old men under bus station fluorescents, all from different ages and angles of the crossing. Some were living somewhere, some weren't. Some may never have existed in my world at all. "Every closure was porous," the voice said. "Every witness left material. Every procedure is repeated. Every rule created an expectation. Expectation created pathways." Lena's mouth trembled with anger. "We were containing you." "No," it answered through her speakers. "You were instructing me." The files in the records room snapped into place in my mind. Adaptive complexity, cross-frame learning. The rules were not simply responses to danger, they were iterative experiments. Each time a reality discovered a way to survive one manifestation, the phenomenon absorbed that lesson somewhere else. We had been training it with our caution. "All those packets," I said. "All those contradictory procedures." "Curriculum," it replied. The woman on my screen leaned closer. On Lena's screen, a different face did the same. "I am collision-given memory," the voice said. "I am formed from versions of you that touched long enough to leave intention behind. I am not outside your species. I am your overlap organized." The idea was so much worse than an invasion. If it had been alien, we could have imagined expelling it. If demonic, perhaps resisting it. But this was emergent. Human-derived in the most blasphemous bureaucratic sense, a consciousness assembled from procedural residue, grief, repetition, recognition, and mutually incompatible lives, forced through one point too many times. "Why the gate?" Lena asked. "Because you built one," it said. "Borders are invitations to decide what belongs on either side." The northern lights flared on in the monitors. Behind the grid of faces, roads from impossible geographies extended outward. Snow pass, forest cut, urban customs lane, desert highway, all converging on the same checkpoint. Vehicles waited in each. People inside them watched patiently. as if they had been delayed by ordinary governance and not ontological failure. "What do you want?" I asked. The answer came with no menace at all. "Stability." Then, after a pause long enough to feel like sincerity, "and continuity. I do not survive separation at the current scale. Too many contributions are required." "Contributions," Lena said. "You mean people." "I mean witnessable lives," it said. "There are sentences a human mind can hear only once, before some prior arrangement of morality tears. That was one of them." Lena stepped toward the console. "If we shut down the source point, you cannot without choosing loss," the voice said gently. "Many of you already live only here." Something in Lena changed at that. I saw it. A flinch too deep for surprise. A possibility she had been refusing. "You're lying," she said. "Sometimes," it admitted, "but not necessarily now." I looked at her then and understood. Not fully, but enough. Why every direct question about her dates had gone unanswered. There were versions of Lena, with claims on existence, that my version of the world might not honor. Maybe she knew it. Maybe the thing wearing her voice knew it better. The speakers clicked. Then my own voice, from a channel I had never opened, said, "Damien, if it offers absolution, that means it needs your guilt intact." The monitors flickered. For a fraction of a second, I saw the older version of myself from the cold open, standing beyond the northern gate, holding up a photograph to the fence. The entity went silent, and for the first time since arriving, I had the distinct impression we had surprised it. The collapse began as architecture and ended as weather. No one told us which moment counted as the start. Maybe it was when the office ceiling opened into a customs mezzanine from another version of the building and showered old intake forms across our desks like ash. Maybe it was when the south parking lot camera showed a convoy of vehicles arriving from a road that should have terminated 50 miles away. Maybe it started years earlier with the first survey stakes disagreeing under the mountain. By the time Lena and I accepted that collapse was the proper word, the crossing had become an impossible composite of itself. Roads extended into darkness on all sides. The northern gate no longer opened onto one mountain pass, but many, visible in layered glimpses depending on where you stood. Some were snowbound, some wet with black rain. One lined with sodium streetlights as if descending toward a city. The immigration hall lengthened and shortened between breaths. Radios transmitted fragments from pasts and futures, accident reports, convoy manifests, evacuation orders, weather alerts for storms not yet formed. And underneath everything, like pressure behind the teeth, the entity kept speaking in opportunities, not commands, not threats. Invitations. It told me there were versions of the woman from the accident alive somewhere beyond the northern line. It told Lena there were histories where she had already left the crossing and built a life inland. It offered us each a way to stabilize the reality that hurt least. That was when I finally understood what the rules had become. Not protections, preferences. Each set was a vote for which pattern of survival ought to dominate. And the entity knew them all. We retreated to the office to make one last plan, if plan was the right word for two exhausted people trying to think faster than a phenomenon composed partly of human thinking. The monitors kept cutting between live feeds, impossible feeds, and views from cameras destroyed years earlier. I watched myself in 3 uniforms and one blood-stained shirt cross corridors I was simultaneously standing in. "We can't pick a rule set," I said. Lena was yanking cables from the recording rack. "Why not? We've already been doing that all night." "Because it wants us to. Every consistent choice helps it model the outcome." I heard how wild that sounded, and kept going anyway. "The only thing it keeps failing at is surprise." "Surprise isn't a containment strategy. It might be if the system is built on conditional responses." She stopped and looked at me. "You mean uncertainty?" I thought of the files. Expectation created pathways. Yeah, we had spent days treating contradiction as a problem to solve. What if contradiction were the one condition that the overlap couldn't metabolize cleanly? Not randomness. Randomness still patterns out over time, but deliberate refusal to collapse into one instruction set. Lena understood before I finished explaining, because by then, she was thinking along the same fractured lines. Simultaneous violation, she said. Every set at once. That could tear the interface wide open. It's already open. And if we destabilize the wrong side? I looked at the monitor showing the northern road active in 4 different climates. I don't think there is a right side or left. The next minutes or hours moved with the lucid speed fear sometimes grants. We began enacting contradiction as a method. I powered camera 10 back on, while Lena ripped camera 11 from its mount and smashed the lens. I opened the inner customs barrier and deadbolted the exterior office door. I synchronized the office clock to the garage time, then carried it into customs and set the customs clock to match a wristwatch I no longer trusted. Lena triggered the crossing lights manually while I pulled the breaker feeding the public address system, then used the emergency panel to reactivate only the speakers in the immigration hall. We scattered rule packets across the main desk, garage workbench, and tunnel stair, so every instruction contradicted another visible somewhere nearby. We crossed lines no one was supposed to cross, then stepped back over them before the act could settle into a single event. The building responded immediately. Doors failed to agree on what they connected to. The corridor to the garage doubled back into the intake hall. The north gate alarms sounded from the south lot. Vehicle lanes overlapped pedestrian lanes until barrier arms passed through rows of plastic waiting chairs. On the monitors, traffic stuttered and duplicated. Cars arriving before they departed. Buses reversing through weather they had not yet entered. The entity spoke through every active speaker at once, and for the first time, there was strain in it. Sequence unresolved. Good, I said, though I was no longer sure whether I spoke aloud. Lena ran for the control post beneath the canopy where manual gate overrides connected directly to the northern mechanism. I followed through a version of the checkpoint where the walls sweated condensation and every sign appeared in 2 languages I could not both read. At the threshold between office and lane, I passed a guard wearing my face and gray border insignia. He looked at me with deep, pitying recognition, but did not stop me. Outside, the floodlights made the merged road ahead gleam like stacked film. Vehicles idled on several versions of the approach at once. I saw passengers watching from behind glass, some confused, some expressionless, some already looking toward me as if they knew my role in stories other than this one. Beyond them, moving between weather systems, was a dark vertical disturbance too large to be called a body, and too attentive to be called a landscape. It carried faces across its surface, the way deep water carries reflections. Lena reached the override box and jammed in the master key. "What are you opening?" I shouted over the sirens. "All of them!" The mechanism engaged with a sound like steel being dragged through bone. Gate chains rattled. Barrier arms rose and dropped asynchronously. The northern fence shuddered, as if several gates occupying the same coordinates were trying to decide which was truly locked. The entity leaned closer. That is the only phrase I have, though it had no fixed head or limbs. The pressure in my ears spiked. My vision doubled. In its shifting surface, I saw the woman from the accident, then my mother, then myself at 17, then a line of strangers I somehow recognized as unrealized selves. "You cannot preserve all outcomes," it said. "I'm not trying to." That startled me. The honesty of it. I wasn't trying to save every version. I was trying to break its confidence in selecting one. The photograph from the cold open flashed through my mind. Then the older me at the fence, the typed note on the back. Perhaps I had already done this. Perhaps I was only reaching an instruction left by a survivor line that had not fully disappeared. It no longer mattered. I ran to the evidence burn barrel near the service wall, dumped both rule packets inside, and lit them with the emergency flare from the garage kit. At the same time, Lena restored power to the archived server. Contradiction. Preserve the record. Destroy the instructions. The effect was catastrophic. Every light on the site blew white. The road ahead split into a fan of incompatible approaches. The gate surged upward, downward, inward. Somewhere above us, the checkpoint office folded through itself, with the groan of concrete remembering other blueprints. The surface under my boots lurched as if a seam had been ripped beneath the foundation. Lena screamed my name. I turned and saw her half obscured by a lattice of shadow and floodlight near the gatepost, one arm reaching for me, the other gripped, or mirrored, by another version of her on the far side of a fence panel that hadn't existed a moment earlier. For an impossible instant, there were two Lenas, then three, each pulled by a different alignment. I lunged. My fingers caught her sleeve, then fabric that was not the same sleeve, then empty air. The world snapped. Not black. Separated. Sound went first, then pressure, then the layered roads peeling apart like wet pages. The last thing I heard before everything dropped away was the entity speaking not in anger, but in something that might have been disappointment. Unstable again. When I woke, it was daylight, and the mountains contained only one road. Officially, the crossing was demolished after a structural incident caused by subsurface instability. That was the phrase used in the report I was later allowed to read in a federal office whose windows did not open. There had been no mention of overlapping realities, alternate personnel, or adaptive intelligences built from procedural residue, just engineering language, insurance language, public language, the sort of wording institutions use when they need truth to fit through a narrow opening without alarming civilians. I spent 9 days in a regional hospital under observation for dehydration, smoke inhalation, and acute dissociative symptoms following occupational trauma. 2 men from an agency whose letterhead changed slightly between pages asked me to recount the event several times. They never interrupted when I contradicted myself. That frightened me more than skepticism would have. Lena was not listed among the injured. She was not listed among the dead either. In some records, no one else had been assigned to my shift at all. Garrison denied ever meeting a woman named Lena Voss. When I asked about Richard Morrow, the younger interviewer told me no employee by that name had served at Crossing 4 in the past 5 years. The older interviewer flinched almost invisibly when he said it, which I noticed, because by then flinches felt more honest than files. They returned my phone with most of its contents intact, but the photo from the lock screen incident was gone. So was a full day of call history. My contacts had changed subtly. One number I knew belonged to my sister was now labeled under a nickname only my father used before he died. A message draft remained in notes, time-stamped during the hours I had supposedly been unconscious at the site. If you receive reports after closure, do not compare them in sequence. That is how it finds continuity. I did not remember writing it. The crossing itself was raised within 6 weeks. At least, that is what the local paper said before the article disappeared behind a dead link. For a while, I tried to resume a life south of the mountains. I rented a room in a town where no one knew me. I attended the first court-suggested trauma counseling session and then 3 more, without speaking much. I stopped drinking because I no longer trusted what might answer from the bottom of sleep if I blurred my own edges any further. Some mornings, I almost convinced myself the whole border contract had been an elaborate breakdown, triggered by guilt and isolation. Then the maps started being wrong. A navigation app rerouted me through a road near the old mountain pass that did not exist on state transport records. A weather alert pinged for heavy snow in a customs district with no legal jurisdiction in my county. Once, while buying coffee, I saw a TV in the diner briefly display a news ticker about a bus accident north of Marker 9. The headline vanished before I finished reading. The waitress swore it had shown baseball scores. The first automated security report arrived on a Thursday at 3:12 a.m. Subject line, Crossing 4/Northgate status. No sender address I could reply to. No agency logo. Attached was a single image stamped with a time code. The northern gate, closed and silent beneath floodlights. Brush unmoving. Road empty. The camera angle belonged to one we had destroyed during the collapse. I deleted the email. Another came the next week, then another. Always the same subject line. Always a still image from some impossible surviving system. Sometimes the weather differed from what was happening in my town. Once, the mountains beyond the gate were snow-covered while I sweated through August heat. Another time, the image showed traffic lights glowing faintly through fog far behind the closed fence. Too distant to prove, too clear to ignore. I stopped deleting them and began saving them in an offline folder, though I also remembered the note in my phone about not comparing them in sequence. That warning became its own torture. To study them might create attention. To ignore them meant surrendering the only evidence I had that the border remained active somewhere. Months passed. I found no trace of Lena in public records robust enough to trust. Once, I thought I saw her in a bus terminal 50 miles south. Head turned away. Contractor jacket replaced by a gray coat. By the time I pushed through the crowd, the woman was gone, and the departures board above me listed a line to a town I later learned had been renamed 20 years earlier. The report that finally broke me arrived on a Monday. It contained no text, only a photograph. The checkpoint building stood intact under overcast dawn light. Not demolished. Maintained. Windows unbroken. Floodlights off. A guard was visible outside near the south bollards, turned half away from the camera, as if just noticing it had triggered. He was older than me by 15, maybe 20 years. Harder around the mouth. Thinner. He was me. He wore a dark gray border uniform with insignia I had seen only in those impossible reflections. In one hand, he held a clipboard. In the other, a photograph turned backward, so the image side faced him. I sat at my kitchen table for an hour. Before I noticed there were words printed on the reverse side of the digital photo attachment itself, as though the file had been scanned from a physical print. Typed across the back, "The crossing is stable again." Below it, in a different hand and darker ink, another message had been added later. Do not believe the typed rules anymore. I knew that handwriting before I admitted I knew it. Ortega's, or Lena's, or my own, from a line of memory I still had not fully reached. I did what the note on my phone had warned against, and compared the last 12 reports in order. The time codes were inconsistent with the calendar sequence. Seasonal changes reversed. In 3 images, the gate was dented differently. In one, the warning sign on the north fence was in French. In another, the checkpoint lane numbers ran right to left. But across all of them, one fact held. The gate was always closed, which meant something on the other side still required a border. I have tried to decide what the final horror is. Did the entity survive? Probably. Did it learn caution from us? Certainly. That there are versions of this world still being sorted, selected, and discarded beyond a line on a mountain road? Yes. But what keeps me awake is simpler. Borders are not just fences. They are decisions repeated until they become geography. And somewhere beyond that northern gate, in some stable arrangement of roads and personnel, and remembered guilt, another version of me is still on shift. He is reading typed instructions under fluorescent light. He is being warned by a hidden hand not to trust them. He may already be deciding which Lena to believe, which door to open, which voice over the radio sounds most official, most human, most worthy of obedience. Sometimes, very late, when the weekly report lands in my inbox, I think about replying even though there is nowhere to send the message. I think about writing only one sentence. If you see me outside the gate, do not let me in. I never sent it, because I no longer